Here we are, talking about torque again. It's been in the news for the cycling world recently, and I'd like to chat about it. Our friends over at SRAM had a run-in with an excessive amount of thread locker, and have since put out a recall notice for the affected levers. If you'd like to know more on that, see the link in the description. What I'd like to talk about is what we should all learn from this experience. To really get a good grasp on what we're learning, let's ask Calvin a question about his bike from 1989. Hey Calvin, what are the torque specs on this bike?
Tight, but not too tight.
See, in those years, mechanics had a lot of responsibility. They had to understand materials and their properties. Mechanics have always had a tool called force checking in their back pocket. Basically, try and force a component to move, and if it does move, it either needs to be tighter or you need to get in and inspect it further. Since then, parts have gotten lighter and started coming in different materials and have overall started flying a little bit closer to the sun. And there's always more bikes and parts being sold online to people who maybe haven't stripped a bolt before, or maybe have never had the joy or satisfaction of using an easy out. In order to give mechanics and riders the best experience possible, torque specs have popped up on almost every nut, bolt, and fastener on a bike. This is a good thing, so that we can all use a special wrench to get a bolt to be tight enough so that it does its job, but also not so tight that it strips or breaks or ruins a component. Just having a baseline understanding of that number and what it feels like gives you such a better chance of success, even without a torque wrench. You basically know how many ooga-doogas you can give a specific fastener. The more knowledge you have, the more you're free to rely on your instincts. Now let's get back to SRAM. Kinda. Everything they did was right. They put thread locker on a bolt on a soft joint, which is important because the fastener is often not able to get to a high enough torque in order to create enough tension to retain itself. They put an appropriate torque value on the fastener to hold the lever in place and prevent it from moving. All seems good in the world until you get to the point where the rubber meets the road. You see, torque is the amount of force needed to rotate an item, and in this case, a bolt. Torque is essentially force times distance, and it can be calculated heavily leaning on that force. What is difficult and often impossible to calculate is the amount of force required to overcome friction introduced by things like corrosion, defects in threads, oil, grease, water, or even thread locker. Let's take a peek at another industry, steel workers, specifically the ones that build skyscrapers. They used to use torque wrenches to tighten the giant bolts that hold the huge skyscrapers together. Now, let's think about what we just talked about and how it could affect a nut and bolt and its torque while building a skyscraper. Let's say you have a bucket of giant bolts that you're using to build a skyscraper, and it starts to rain. And you leave it up there while you escape the rain. You get back to work and start assembling the giant building again. The fasteners are now corroded. Your fasteners are still torqued to the same spec, but are now not drawn up to the same amount of tension. The tension creates preload, which is the force that actually does most of the work in a fastened joint. So what do steel workers use now? Often they use special bolts or special washers that ooze silicone out of them once they've reached a specific tension. So a worker will tighten the bolt until they see the silicone. The inspector will walk around and make sure that all the nuts and bolts have the correct amount of silicone exiting the washer, and the structure stands the test of time, and everyone's happy. Let's loop back to the wonderful world of bikes, and to my personal favorite component, the wheel. When we build wheels, we draw spokes up to tension evenly. We pay attention to lateral true and radial true, but of course the spoke's tension. And at the end of the day, the most important structural aspect of a wheel is the spoke's relative tension. If it's correct, it does not matter how straight, up and down, or left and right the wheel is. It is at least strong and will last. A good example of this is Calvin's clown wheels, or other more abstract tensegrity structures. So now in wheels, we use a tension meter to tell us how tight or loose a spoke is. Why would we not use a torque wrench at the nipple? Well, because we don't have to. And it turns out that a tension meter is far more accurate, and it is how we wish we could measure a standard bolt. What we are measuring is deflection, which allows us to much more accurately calculate tension. Very exciting stuff, but let's get our hands on some tools and make some comparisons. See, I have this wheel, and a quarter of the spokes are assembled with thread locker, a quarter of the spokes are assembled with lubricant, a quarter of the spokes are assembled with nothing at all, and a quarter of the spokes are assembled with linseed oil. All of these spokes are drawn up to 96 kgf. I then checked the torque at the nipple on each one. The most interesting part about the results is that none of them are as consistent as we wish they were. At the same tension, some of the spokes with the same thread prep were upwards of over 300% different in torque. So, moral of the story here is that, as we have said before, a torque wrench is a great and useful tool, but it is not a magic wand. And that you should torque, but you should also verify with a force check if possible. But most importantly, you should use your mechanical mind and your experience when working on anything. Thanks for joining me today. Get out there, get your hands dirty, use some tools, have fun. Cheers.